The air is the first thing you register. It is a thick, complex mixture that clings to the back of your throat. There is the sharp tang of salt blown up from the two harbors that flank the city, a constant reminder of the sea that brought you here in chains. Underneath, that is the cloying sweetness of myrrh and burning oils, a sacred perfume that fails to mask the more human smells. Sweat, cheap wine, and the dust of 1,000 sandals on stone. The tunic they've given you is coarse, rubbing your skin raw where the ropes had been moments before. You stand in a colonnaded courtyard, your eyes struggling to adjust to the torchlight that dances off polished marble and gilded statues. Below the city of Corinth is a sprawling constellation of man-made lights, a testament to its immense wealth. But you are not in the city. You have been led up the winding path to the summit of the Acrocorinth, the fortress of rock that looms over the isthmus. Here at the pinnacle of power stands the temple. A priest, his face a mask of serene indifference, murmurs words you do not understand. He anoints your forehead with oil, and the gesture feels less like a blessing and more like the marking of livestock. You are no longer a person. You are property, a votive offering made of flesh to the goddess Aphrodite. This experience, or one tragically similar, was the brutal entry point into a life of consecrated servitude. Before we unseal these forgotten records, consider this a moment to register your presence. A like serves as your signature, and a subscription grants you access to all future findings, provided you believe these stories must be unearthed. In the comments below, share your thoughts on the most misunderstood figure in history. The time for speculation has passed. Let the shadows gather, and we shall now piece together the fragmented clues. To understand the institution of sacred prostitution in Corinth, one must first understand the city itself. In the ancient world, geography was destiny, and Corinth was singularly blessed and cursed by its location. It's at astride the narrow isthmus connecting the Peloponnesian Peninsula to the mainland of Greece's land-to-land bridge that served as a choke point for all north-south land traffic. More importantly, it possessed a major port. Lycion on the Gulf of Corinth to the west and Hierodoulos on the Saronic Gulf to the east. This unique position allowed it to function as the preeminent commercial intermediary between the eastern and western Mediterranean. Ships sailing from Asia Minor and Egypt could dock at Hierodoulos, have their cargo transported overland a few miles and reloaded onto different ships at Lycion bound for Italy and Sicily. This process, known as the dial course, allowed merchants to avoid the treacherous and lengthy sea voyage around the storm-ridden southern capes of the Peloponnese. The result was a constant torrential flow of goods, money, and people. Corinth became a city of merchants, sailors, bankers, and artisans. Its wealth was legendary, its markets famously chaotic, and its population notoriously transient and diverse. Unlike the martial society of Sparta or the intellectual polis of Athens, Corinth's identity was forged in the crucible of commerce. With this immense material prosperity came a reputation for luxury, decadence, and a pragmatic transactional approach to morality. The term to Corinthianize entered the Greek lexicon as a verb meaning to engage in debauchery and immoral excess. This was the environment in which the Temple of Aphrodite on the Acrocorinth not only existed but thrived, becoming an institution that mirrored the city's own character. Wealthy, powerful, and deeply pragmatic in its fusion of the spiritual with the commercial, the goddess worshipped here was not merely a deity of love and beauty in the abstract sense. She was a patroness of the city's lifeblood, the raw, chaotic, and often brutal energy of the port. The sailors who survived a perilous journey would climb the Acrocorinth to give thanks. The merchants who closed a profitable deal would dedicate a portion of their earnings. The city itself viewed the temple as a civic and economic asset, a major attraction that drew pilgrims and their money from across the Greek world. It was within this context of civic pride and commercial religion that the temple's most notorious practice was allowed to flourish, not as a hidden shame, but as an integral part of its divine and economic function. The bodies of its consecrated servants were merely another commodity in a city built on trade, their sanctity but a near for an operation of brutal efficiency. The deity who presided over this grand enterprise was not a simple goddess of romance or ethereal beauty. The Aphrodite of the Acrocorinth was a specific and highly pragmatic manifestation of the divine, known by the epithet penned Emos. The name itself is revealing, translating to of all the people are common to all. This was not Aphrodite, Urania, the celestial heavenly goddess of idealized love and philosophical union worshipped by the Athenian elite. Aphrodite Pandemos was a goddess of the earth, of the physical, of the practical necessities of human interaction in a crowded and complex society. Her domain was the agora, the port, and the bedroom. She was the patroness of the city's entire populace, from the highest magistrate to the lowest dock worker, from the wealthy matron to the foreign courtisan. In a city like Corinth, teeming with a transient and multicultural population of sailors, merchants, and artisans from across the known world, such a unifying, accessible deity was a civic necessity. She provided a common religious touchstone for individuals who shared no other tribal or ancestral bonds. Her role was therefore deeply intertwined with the city's commercial life. Aphrodite Pandemos blessed the unions that generated wealth and social stability. This extended beyond marital or romantic pairings to encompass business partnerships, political alliances, and the simple daily transactions that kept the city's economic heart beating. A merchant might pray to her for a favorable contract, a sailor for a safe and profitable journey, a politician for the unity of the citizenry. The goddess was a guarantor of social cohesion, smoothing the frictions inherent in a high-density multicultural urban environment. She was in essence the divine lubricant for the machinery of Corinthian society. It is within this conceptual framework that the practice of sacred prostitution must be understood. It was not seen as a debased perversion of a holy space, but rather as the ultimate expression of the goddess's function. The temple under her divine patronage offered a regulated and consecrated outlet for the physical desires that pulsed through the city. For a sailor who had spent months at sea or a merchant far from home, a visit to the temple on the Acrocorinth was framed as an act of piety. The transaction was elevated from a base commercial exchange to a sacred rite, an offering made to the goddess who governed such unions. The revenue generated in turn funded the temple's magnificent upkeep, paid its extensive staff of priests and administrators, and reinforced its power and prestige within the city. This practice also likely drew upon older traditions. The Greek Aphrodite herself evolved from earlier Near Eastern deities, such as the Phoenician Astarte and the Babylonian Ishtar, goddesses of both love and war, whose cults had long included practices of sacred prostitution. As a major trading partner with the cities of the Levant, Corinth would have been a natural point of entry for these cultural and religious ideas, which found fertile ground in its own commercially oriented society. The practice, therefore, was not a strange anomaly but a syncretic institution, blending Greek religious concepts with older imported traditions that suited the city's unique character. This divine sanction created a profound and disturbing paradox for the individuals who were the instruments of this worship. They existed in a state of suspended reality, their bodies designated as sacred conduits for a divine transaction, yet their lives were defined by a total lack of personal agency. They were holy objects, yet they were also slaves. The individual at the heart of this sacred economy occupied a unique and profoundly conflicted position in Greek society. The specific term for such a person was Hierodoulos, a compound word that encapsulates the core paradox of their existence. The first part, hieros, means sacred, holy, or consecrated to a god. The second part, doulos, is the common Greek word for slave. Sacred slave. The very name is a contradiction, a fusion of the divine and the debased, the revered and the owned. This was not a metaphorical title. It was a precise legal and social classification that governed every aspect of their lives. Legally, the doulos aspect was paramount. A hierodoulos was property. They could be bought, sold, or bequeathed in a will just like any other piece of chattel. Crucially, they could also be dedicated to the temple as a votive offering, a human gift to the goddess, often in fulfillment of a vow, or as a demonstration of immense piety and wealth by the donor. Once consecrated to the temple, they became the legal property of the deity herself. This divine ownership distinguished them from all other categories of slaves. A common household slave was owned by a private citizen. A public slave, demos ios, was owned by the city-state and might perform administrative or clerical tasks. But a hierodoulos was owned by a god, and their master was the temple administration, acting as the earthly stewards of the goddess's property. This status meant they had no bodily autonomy, no right to refuse a come, and no legal recourse against abuse, and no freedom to leave. Their purpose was to serve the temple and generate revenue, and the primary means of doing so was through the use of their bodies in ritualized sexual acts. The income they generated did not belong to them. It flowed directly into the temple treasury, contributing to its vast wealth. Yet the heroes aspect of their title was not meaningless. It set them apart and created a complex social dynamic. As property of Aphrodite, they were in a sense untouchable by the outside world. To harm or disrespect a Hierodoulos was not merely an assault on a slave, but an act of sacrilege against the goddess herself, an offense that could bring divine wrath upon the perpetrator. This likely afforded them a degree of protection from the casual violence and abuse that was the common lot of other slaves in the ancient world. They were also likely better fed, clothed, and housed than slaves performing manual labor in mines or on farms. They lived within the precinct of one of the wealthiest and most prestigious religious sites in all of Greece. They were participants, albeit involuntary ones, in a sacred function that was seen as vital to the city's prosperity. This sacred status, however, was the very mechanism of their entrapment. It provided an unassailable justification for their exploitation. While a private slave owner might be constrained by social custom or the simple economic need to preserve the health of his property, the temple operated under a divine mandate. The use of the Hierodoulos' body was not exploitation in their view. It was a holy service, an act of worship. The sacredness of their role became a cage locking them into their function with the full weight of religious authority. This created a profound cognitive dissonance. The Hierodoulos was simultaneously a person and an object, a participant in a holy rite and a piece of commercial equipment, a being set apart for a god and a slave whose body was a public commodity. This liminal state, neither fully priest nor fully slave, placed them in a unique, isolated, and psychologically fraught position within the rigid social hierarchy of the Greek polis. They were living symbols of Corinth's most defining characteristics, its piety and its commerce inextricably and brutally merged into a single human form. The legal and social status of the Hierodoulos having been established, the inquiry naturally turns to the mechanisms by which individuals, particularly young men and women, were funneled into this unique form of bondage. The pathways into temple servitude were varied, reflecting the harsh realities of the ancient world. They were not typically born of religious calling or voluntary devotion, but of violence, commerce, and desperation, which the temple as a powerful institution was positioned to exploit. The primary and most brutal source was warfare. In the aftermath of a successful military campaign, it was standard practice for the victorious city-state to enslave the population of the conquered city. A portion of these captives, considered part of the spoils of war, was often dedicated to the city's patron deity as a tithe or thank offering. A wealthy general or the state itself might dedicate a group of captured youths to the Temple of Aphrodite. These individuals, violently uprooted from their homes and stripped of their identities, would arrive in Corinth as human tribute, their consecration to the goddess, a final irreversible seal on their enslavement. A second, more commercial avenue was through the sprawling slave markets that were a ubiquitous feature of major trade hubs like Corinth. The city's ports made it a prime location for the slave trade, with human cargo arriving from across the Mediterranean and the Black Sea, captured by pirates, sold by impoverished families, or bred for the market. The Temple of Aphrodite, with its immense and constant stream of revenue, was a wealthy institution. Its administrators would have acted as discerning buyers in these markets, acquiring individuals for service. Historical sources suggest that physical attractiveness and youth were highly valued commodities, and the temple would have had the resources to purchase the most sought-after individuals. In this context, a person's entry into sacred servitude was a simple financial transaction, a transfer of ownership from a slave trader to the temple, and acquisition of a new asset for the goddess's portfolio. Beyond these methods of force and commerce, individuals could also be dedicated to the temple by private citizens. A wealthy merchant fulfilling a vow made to Aphrodite in exchange for a safeful business venture might purchase a young slave and formally donate them to the temple. This act served as both a display of piety and a public demonstration of the donor's wealth and status. Inscriptions found in other parts of the Greek world record such dedications, providing a material record of this practice. It is also plausible that some families facing extreme poverty or debt might have sold a child into temple servitude. In their desperate calculus, the life of a Hierodoulos, with the promise of food, shelter, and a form of sacred protection, may have seemed a preferable alternative to starvation or the brutal labor of the mines. Finally, the system was self-perpetuating through birth. Any child born to a female Hierodoulos automatically inherited their mother's status. They were born the property of the temple, their lives and futures predetermined from the moment of conception. These children would be raised within the temple precinct, knowing no other world. Their training and indoctrination would begin in early childhood, shaping them for the specific duties they were destined to perform. This created a sustainable generational workforce for the temple, ensuring a continuous supply of consecrated servants without the need for constant external acquisition. These diverse streams of human acquisition, from the spoils of war, the public market, private piety, and hereditary bondage, all fed into a single vast reservoir of labor, which the temple administration organized with remarkable and chilling efficiency. The acquisition of human assets, as detailed, was merely the first step in a complex economic process. The Temple of Aphrodite on the Acrocorinth must not be understood as a simple house of worship. It was a formidable economic powerhouse, a corporation, cloaked in the mantle of divinity, with a diversified portfolio of assets and multiple streams of revenue. At the core of its business model, the most infamous and likely most lucrative division was the system of sacred prostitution. This was not an informal or clandestine activity, but a highly organized and administered part of the temple's function. The historian Strabo, writing centuries later, but drawing on earlier sources, famously claimed that the temple at one time owned more than 1,000 Hierodoulos. While this figure is likely an exaggeration intended to emphasize Corinth's reputation for decadence, it nevertheless indicates that the scale of the operation was vast and widely known throughout the ancient world. The revenue from this source was direct and substantial. Pilgrims, merchants, and sailors visiting the temple would make a monetary offering or donation in exchange for the services of a consecrated slave. This transaction was carefully framed as a religious act of fee gift to the goddess. The money, however, went directly into the temple's treasury, managed by a class of priests and administrators. This single revenue stream, however potent, was far from the only one. Like many major religious sanctuaries in antiquity, the temple was a significant landowner. Over generations, it would have accumulated vast tracts of agricultural land throughout the Corinthian territory, donated by pious and wealthy patrons. These estates were not managed directly, but were leased out to tenant farmers who would pay a percentage of their harvest to the temple as rent. This provided a stable, predictable, and passive income that was insulated from the daily fluctuations of port commerce. The temple also likely owned valuable real estate within the city itself, workshops, houses, and storefronts, while generating rental income. Furthermore, the practice of dedicating votive offerings was a major source of capital. Wealthy individuals would donate statues of precious metal, intricate jewelry, expensive textiles, and caches of gold and silver coins. While some items were kept for display to showcase the temple's prestige, many were essentially liquid assets. Gold and silver could be melted down into bullion and stored in the temple's heavily guarded vaults, forming a substantial capital reserve. The temple also controlled and profited from the apparatus of worship itself. The sale of sacrificial animals, for instance, was a highly lucrative enterprise. A worshipper wishing to make a sacrifice to Aphrodite would be required to purchase an animal, typically of goat or other approved creature, from vendors operating under the temple's license, often at a significant markup. After the ritual slaughter, a portion of the meat was burned for the goddess, another portion went to the priests, and the remainder could be sold in a temple-run market to the general public. This created a closed economically where the temple profited from every stage of the sacrificial rite. Finally, with its immense wealth and secure sacrosanct status, the temple likely functioned as a proto-bank. Its vaults were the safest place in the city to store valuables. Wealthy individuals could deposit their gold and silver for safekeeping for a fee. The temple could then use these vast deposits, along with its own reserves, to issue loans at interest. It could lend money to merchants financing a shipping venture, to aristocrats facing a temporary cash shortage, or even to the city of Corinth itself in times of need, making the temple a major creditor and a powerful player in regional politics. This complex economic structure was managed by a sophisticated administrative apparatus, a hierarchy of priests and officials who were not just spiritual leaders, but also estate managers, treasurers, and investment bankers. Within this vast and diversified enterprise, the Hierodoulos were the most ruthlessly efficient asset, the point at which the sacred and the commercial converge, converting physical intimacy directly into the hard currency that fueled the temple's earthly power. The vast economic engine of the temple, built on land tithes and finance, required a consistent fuel source. The deployment of its human assets, the Hierodoulos, was the point at which this engine ran most efficiently, converting piety to revenue through a meticulously structured process. The mechanics of this holy rite were designed to distinguish it at every step from the common prostitution that was prevalent in the lower city. This distinction was crucial for maintaining the temple's sacred authority and for allowing patrons to frame their participation as an act of legitimate worship. The process would have begun not in a shadowy alleyway but in the public sunlit precincts of the temple complex. A visitor, be it a foreign merchant, a sailor giving thanks for a safe passage, or a local citizen seeking the goddess's favor, would approach a designated temple official or priest. The initial exchange was a financial one, but it was couched in the language of religious offering. The patron would not haggle over a price, but would state the value of the donation they wished to make to the goddess. The scale of this donation likely determined the nature of the subsequent experience. A larger offering might afford a more desirable or experienced servant, or perhaps a more elaborate set of preliminary rituals. Once the offering was paid and duly recorded in the temple's ledgers, the patron would be led away from the public areas of worship into a more secluded part of the complex. These were likely designated chambers built and furnished specifically for this purpose. The environment would have been carefully controlled to reinforce the sanctity of the act. The air would be heavy with incense, the rooms lit by the soft glow of oil lamps, and the walls possibly adorned with religious frescoes depicting myths of Aphrodite. The goal was to create a sensory threshold separating the profane world of the city below from the sacred space of the goddess. Before the rite itself, the patron would likely undergo a form of ritual purification. This could involve washing their hands and face in a basin of consecrated water, a symbolic cleansing of worldly concerns. A short prayer or invocation to Aphrodite would be recited, perhaps by the accompanying priest, formally dedicating the upcoming act to the goddess. At this point, the Hierodoulos would be brought to the chamber. They would have been similarly prepared, bathed, perfumed, and dressed in attire appropriate to their sacred role. Their demeanor, cultivated through years of training and indoctrination, was expected to be one of serene and impersonal service. They were not presenting themselves as an individual personality, but as a living conduit for the goddess's power. The physical union that followed was thus framed not as an act of personal intimacy or lust, but as the consummation of the offering made earlier. It was a three-part transaction. The patron offered their money and devotion to the goddess, and in return the goddess, through the vessel of her sacred slave, bestowed upon the patron her favor, be it good fortune, safe travels, or physical release. The Hierodoulos was the silent, passive intermediary in this sacred exchange. Upon completion of the rite, the protocol was equally structured. There was no lingering intimacy. The patron would depart, their religious and personal objectives fulfilled. The Hierodoulos would return to their designated quarters within the temple, their duty performed. The entire procedure was characterized by a profound and deliberate impersonality. It was a standardized, repeatable, and highly efficient system for processing the spiritual and physical needs of the temple's clientele. Each encounter was a closed loop. A financial offering was converted into a ritual act, which in turn reinforced the temple's religious authority and economic power. The sacred mechanics served to launder a base transaction, elevating it into an act of piety, and in doing so provided the ultimate justification for the lifelong bondage of the men and women who were its essential instruments. While the Temple of Aphrodite employed both male and female servants, the position of the male Hierodoulos presents a particularly stark and complex case study in social and psychological dynamics. His existence was a direct confrontation with the prevailing ideals of masculinity that formed the bedrock of Hellenic culture. In the Greek worldview, the ideal male citizen was defined by his agency, his dominance, and his role as an active participant in all spheres of life. In sexual matters, this translated into a rigid hierarchy where the citizen male was expected to be the active, penetrative partner. The receptive role was culturally coded as passive and subordinate, a position assigned to women, non-citizens, and slaves. The body of a free Greek man was an instrument of his will, honed in the gymnasium for athletic competition and disciplined on the battlefield for the defense of the polis. It was a symbol of his strength, autonomy, and civic virtue. The consecrated male body of the Hierodoulos was the antithesis of this ideal. His body was not his own. It was the property of the temple, an instrument to be used for the fulfillment of a sacred yet passive function. His entire existence was structured around receptivity and submission, a permanent and professional embodiment of the role that free men ought to avoid. This placed him in an inescapable state of social paradox. On the Acrocorinth within the sacred precinct, he was a holy vessel, a participant in a divine mystery, and to harm him was to offend the goddess. But if he were to descend into the city, his function, if known, would have marked him with a profound social stigma. He was a living inversion of the masculine ideal, a man whose purpose was defined by the negation of male agency. The clientele who sought the services of a male Hierodoulos would have been driven by a complex set of motivations. For some, particularly merchants and sailors from the Near East, where traditions of male temple prostitution were more established, the act may have been a familiar form of worship. For Greek patrons, the motivations were likely more layered. Pederastic relationships between an older citizen male and an adolescent youth were an accepted, if highly ritualized, part of life in many city-states, but these relationships were governed by strict social codes and were meant to be temporary and educational. Commercial homosexual encounters with common street prostitutes or porno were available in the lower city, but carried a social taint. The temple offered a unique third space. It provided an opportunity for a sexual encounter between men that was sanctified by divine authority. The transaction was laundered of its potential social shame by its religious framing. The patron was not merely satisfying a personal desire. He was making an offering to Aphrodite, and the act was a form of communion with the divine. The psychological burden on the male Hierodoulos must be considered. He was indoctrinated to believe in the sanctity of his role that brought wealth and prestige to the temple that was his entire world. Yet he existed in a culture that equated his function with the lowest forms of social and personal degradation. This cognitive dissonance would have been a constant feature of his consciousness. He was simultaneously sacred and debased, an object of religious veneration and a symbol of profound unmanliness. His life was likely one of careful management and control by the temple authorities. His diet, exercise, and grooming would have been meticulously regulated, not for his own well-being but to maintain the physical appeal and ritual purity of a valuable temple asset. He was kept apart, a consecrated object whose value lay in his otherness. This isolation, sacred yet shameful, protected yet powerless, defined the unique and tragic existence of the men who served the goddess in this most intimate and contradictory of roles. The sacred rite, impersonal and efficient, was the central gear in the temple's revenue machine. But the true nature of the institution is revealed, not in the act itself but in the meticulous accounting that followed. The flow of money from the patrons' purse to the temple's vaults was a carefully managed process governed by the same principles of bookkeeping and financial administration that one would find in any major Corinthian shipping company or banking house. It was a spiritual enterprise underwritten by a rigorously secular bureaucracy. The offering made by the patron was not simply dropped into a collection box. It was received by a designated temple official, likely a junior priest or a trusted public slave trained as a scribe. The amount would be noted perhaps alongside the name of the donor, if they were a person of significance. For a major donation, a receipt in the form of a clay or wax tablet might even be issued, serving as proof of the donor's piety. These funds, collected from dozens of such transactions each day, would be regularly transferred from the points of collection to a central administrative office within the temple complex, a treasury known as the Soros. Here, under heavy guard, the daily takings would be counted, sorted, and recorded in ledgers. Scribes would meticulously document the income, differentiating between currencies. Athenian silver owls, Corinthian quartz, Persian dairy, CS, and Egyptian coins all flowed through the city's ports and into the temple's coffers. This was the first layer of the temple's financial apparatus. The conversion of ritual acts into recorded quantifiable income. Once recorded, this revenue was allocated according to a complex budget that sustained the entire temple ecosystem. The first and most immediate expense was the operational overhead. This included the direct maintenance of the human assets themselves. A significant portion of the income was reinvested into the Hierodoulos, but not in the form of wages or personal property. Instead, funds were allocated for their food, clothing, housing, and any necessary medical care. This was not an act of benevolence, but of sound asset management. A well-fed and healthy servant was more appealing and could perform their duties more consistently, ensuring a stable and uninterrupted revenue stream. Beyond the maintenance of the slaves, a large portion of the budget was dedicated to the salaries and stipends of the temple's extensive staff. The senior priests and priestesses who presided over the major festivals and managed the institution's political and religious affairs received substantial incomes befitting their high status. Beneath them was a hierarchy of administrators, scribes, treasurers, and overseers who managed the day-to-day operations, from tracking finances to supervising the temple's agricultural estates. Guards had to be paid to protect the temple's immense wealth, and artisans were employed for the constant upkeep of the building, statues, and ritual implements. The physical plant of the temple itself represented a massive ongoing expense. The marble colonnades needed to be maintained, the gilded roofs required occasional repair, and the vast quantities of incense, perfumed oils, and sacrificial animals consumed in daily worship had to be perpetually restocked. Only after all these operational costs were met was the remaining income considered profit. This surplus was the source of the temple's true power. A portion was reinvested back into the enterprise, most directly by purchasing new slaves from the market to replace those who had aged, died, or otherwise lost their value. The rest was added to the temple's capital reserves, stored as gold and silver bullion in its heavily fortified vaults. This accumulated wealth was not idle. It was the foundation of the temple's influence, allowing it to act as a major lender, a political patron, and a force of economic stability in the region. In this cold financial calculus, the Hierodoulos was reduced to an entry on a balance sheet. They represented a capital asset acquired at a certain cost with an ongoing maintenance expense. Their function was to generate a stream of revenue that over their lifetime was expected to far exceed the total investment. Their entire existence, from the moment of their acquisition to the end of their service, could be tracked, measured, and quantified in the dispassionate language of accounting. For the Hierodoulos, the stark economic realities of their existence translated into a highly structured and controlled daily life within the temple walls. While they were nominally set apart as sacred beings, their actual living conditions were likely more akin to those of well-managed livestock than revered priests. The day would have begun before dawn. The Hierodoulos were roused from their communal sleeping quarters, which were likely simple dormitories, perhaps, with individual cubicles but lacking in any real privacy. They would have been provided with a basic, if adequate, breakfast, a ration of bread, olives, and perhaps some watered-down wine. The purpose was not to provide luxury, but to ensure they had the physical stamina to perform their duties throughout the day. Following breakfast, the day was structured around a rigorous routine of personal grooming and ritual preparation. They would be bathed either in public bathhouses or in designated areas within the temple complex. Their bodies would be oiled and perfumed, and their hair carefully styled. The goal was to present them as visually appealing and physically clean, ready to embody their sacred role. They would then be dressed in attire appropriate to their function. This likely consisted of simple lightweight tunics made of linen or wool, perhaps dyed in colors associated with Aphrodite, such as white, saffron yellow, or sea blue. Jewelry such as necklaces, bracelets, and anklets might be added not as personal adornments, but as symbols of their sacred status and indicators of the temple's wealth. The middle of the day was dedicated to their primary function, serving the patrons who came to the temple. The amount of time spent in this activity would have varied based on the temple's schedule, the number of visitors, and the individual's physical endurance. Between encounters, they would be required to remain within designated waiting areas, perhaps courtyards or collects out of sight from the general public but readily available when summoned. During these periods, they would be closely supervised by temple attendants or junior priests who would ensure they maintained the proper demeanor and did not engage in unauthorized interactions. Meals would be provided throughout the day, again focused on sustenance rather than pleasure. The diet likely consisted of simple locally sourced foods: grains, vegetables, olives, figs, and occasional portions of meat or fish. The emphasis was on a balanced and easily digestible diet that would maintain their physical health and appearance. In the evenings, after the flow of visitors slowed down, the Hierodoulos would participate in various religious ceremonies and rituals. This was a key aspect of their indoctrination, reinforcing their belief in the sanctity of their role and the power of Aphrodite. They would sing hymns, participate in processions, and perhaps even perform ritual dances. The purpose was to integrate them fully into the temple's religious life, blurring the lines between their functional duty and their spiritual identity. Before retiring to their sleeping quarters, they would undergo a final cleansing ritual, washing away the physical traces of the day's encounters and reaffirming their sacred status. Throughout this carefully regimented daily routine, the emphasis was on control and conformity. The Hierodoulos were not permitted to leave the temple grounds without explicit permission. Their interactions with the outside world were strictly limited and their personal autonomy was virtually non-existent. Their lives were dedicated to the service of the goddess and the economic well-being of the temple, their individual desires and aspirations suppressed in favor of the collective function. This existence, meticulously crafted to maximize their value as sacred assets, created a profound psychological strain. The constant pressure to conform, the lack of personal agency, and the inherent contradiction between their sacred status and their enslaved condition would have left deep scars, transforming them into living embodiments of the temple's paradoxical union of piety and exploitation. The meticulously structured routine of life within the temple precinct was more than a system of physical management. It was an apparatus of psychological conditioning. To analyze the institution of the Hierodoulos solely in economic or social terms is to miss the most profound and disturbing element of their existence: the colonization of the inner self. One must therefore attempt to reconstruct the potential psychological landscape inhabited by these individuals, a landscape defined by the fundamental and irresolvable conflict between their sacred designation and their enslaved reality. This conflict is best understood the modern psychological lens of cognitive dissonance, the state of mental discomfort experienced by a person who holds two or more contradictory beliefs, ideas, or values. The entire temple system was in effect a machine for inducing and then managing this dissonance on an industrial scale. The first and most powerful belief actively, unrelentlessly cultivated by the temple authorities was that of their own sanctity. From the moment of their consecration or from birth within the precinct, the Hierodoulos would have been immersed in an environment that affirmed their special status. They participated in daily rituals, wore consecrated garments, and were addressed with a vocabulary of religious reverence. They were told and expected to believe that they were the chosen servants of a great goddess, the physical embodiment of her power, and that their service was essential for the prosperity of the city and the favor of the divine. This indoctrination was not a superficial veneer. It was a totalizing worldview enforced by every aspect of their controlled existence. It provided a framework of meaning and purpose for a life that would otherwise be unbearable. This carefully constructed belief system, however, was in constant violent collision with the lived reality of their daily function. The reality was one of absolute powerlessness. They had no control over their own bodies. They were compelled to engage in intimate acts with a succession of anonymous strangers, an experience devoid of personal choice or emotional connection. They witnessed their own sacred service being reduced to a financial transaction, the offering counted and recorded by temple scribes. They were in the most literal sense human commodities, their value assessed in terms of their physical appeal and their capacity to generate revenue. This reality directly the indoctrinated belief in their own sanctity. The mind, unable to hold both of these truths simultaneously without fracturing, would have been forced to adopt powerful coping mechanisms. For some, particularly those born and raised within the temple walls who knew no other life, the resolution may have been a complete and genuine internalisation of the official ideology. By fully believing in their sacred purpose, they could reframe the impersonal encounters not as exploitation, but as acts of supreme piety. The stranger was not a client but a pilgrim. The act was not sexual but sacramental. This deep-seated belief would have functioned as a powerful psychological shield, rendering the trauma of their daily lives into a form of religious ecstasy. They would become the ideal servant, placid, obedient, and utterly convinced of the righteousness of their own servitude. For many others, this complete internalization would have been impossible. A more likely and widespread response would have been a profound state of dissociation. This is a psychological defense mechanism in which the mind detaches from physical or emotional experience to withstand overwhelming trauma. The Hierodoulos would learn to create a schism between mind and body. The physical self would perform the required duties with the expected serene and impersonal demeanor, while the conscious self would retreat to an inner sanctum, becoming a detached observer of its own life. This would explain the accounts of their placid, almost unearthly composure. It was not a sign of contentment, but the mask of a deep and necessary psychological severance. This state would allow them to endure the intolerable, but at the cost of a fragmented identity and an inability to experience genuine connection or emotional presence. The trauma was not avoided merely deep within the psyche, where it would fester unseen. The serene slave of the goddess was in all likelihood a person who had psychologically abandoned their own body in order to survive its use by others. This system of managed psychological trauma could not exist in a vacuum. It was a symbiotic structure, and for every consecrated slave performing their duty, there was a patron whose participation was essential for the entire enterprise to function. To understand the temple's enduring power, one must dissect the other side of the transaction, profiling the diverse clientele who climbed the Acrocorinth and the complex web of motivations that drove them. They were not a monolithic group of debauched individuals. They were a cross-section of the ancient Mediterranean world, each bringing their own needs, beliefs, and justifications to the sacred precinct. Their collective patronage provided the constant stream of revenue and the social license that allowed the institution to thrive for centuries. The most numerous and straightforward category of patrons consisted of the transient male population that defined Corinthian life: the sailors, the merchants, agents, and the mercenary soldiers. For a sailor arriving at Lachai on Chrea after months at sea, Corinth was a city of legendary release. These men, living in a state of enforced abstinence and constant physical hardship, possessed both accumulated pay and powerful physical urges. While the lower city offered a plethora of common brothels and taverns, the Temple of Aphrodite offered something more. It provided a veneer of spiritual legitimacy to what was in essence a carnal transaction. By making his offering at the temple, a sailor was not merely seeking pleasure. He was giving thanks to the goddess for a safe voyage and seeking her blessing for the next. This act of transcational piety transformed base need into a holy rite, allowing him to fulfill his desires while simultaneously fulfilling a perceived religious duty. A second, more influential group was composed of the wealthy merchants and businessmen, both local and foreign, for whom Corinth was a critical hub. Their motivations were often deeply intertwined with their commercial activities. Aphrodite Pandemos was a patroness of civic harmony and successful enterprise. For a merchant about to embark on a risky shipping venture, or one who had just concluded a highly profitable deed, a visit to the temple was a prudent divine investment. The offering made was a tangible demonstration of gratitude and a down payment on future favor. The rite that followed was the symbolic consummation of this contract with the divine. It was a way of embedding their commercial success within the city's most powerful religious framework. For this class, the temple's services were a form of sophisticated networking, or the public display of both piety and prosperity. Making a conspicuously large donation was a signal to their peers of their success and their standing within the community. The third category comprised the genuine pilgrims. These were individuals from across the Greek world who traveled to Corinth specifically to visit the famous sanctuary. Their motivations were primarily spiritual. They might be seeking a cure for barrenness, guidance on a marital matter, or simply to pay homage at a renowned holy site. For this group, the sexual rite was not an end in itself, but was understood as the most direct and potent form of communion with the goddess of physical love and procreation. They approached the act with a sense of religious awe, believing that through the body of the consecrated slave, they were receiving a direct infusion of the goddess's divine power. Their participation was an act of sincere, if to modern sensibilities, alien devotion. Finally, there was the local Corinthian aristocracy and citizenry. For this group, patronage of the temple was a complex expression of civic identity. The temple was a source of immense pride and prestige for the city, and supporting it was a patriotic duty. For the male citizen, the temple also provided a uniquely sanctioned space. As previously discussed, it offered a discreet and sacrosanct environment for homosexual encounters, removed from the social complexities and potential stigmas of relationships in the secular world. The sacred status of the Hierodoulos removed the act from the realm of the ordinary, elevating it into an experience that was both transgressive and divinely approved. Across all these categories, the temple's unique function as an ideological laundry. It took the raw materials of human desire, lust, greed, ambition, fear, and processed them through a sacred filter, returning them to the patron as legitimized acts of piety. It was this masterful psychological service, as much as the physical one, that constituted the temple's core product and ensured a steady and willing clientele. The motivations of the temple's patrons varied, as they were all converged upon a single non-negotiable legal fact: the absolute and total ownership of the Hierodoulos' body by the temple. To fully grasp the mechanics of this exploitation, one must move from the psychology of the participants to the cold and yielding architecture of the law. In the city-states of ancient Greece, the concept of legal personhood was not universal. The fundamental legal distinction was between the citizen and the non-citizen, and within that latter category the most profound gulf was the one that separated the free from the enslaved. A slave by legal definition was not a person. They were a chattel, an animate tool, as the philosopher Aristotle would later classify them. This classification was not a metaphor. It was the bedrock of their legal existence, or rather their lack thereof. As a doulos, a sacred slave, was stripped of all the basic rights that defined a legal person. They could not own property. Anything they might acquire was legally the property of their owner. They could not enter into a contract, as they had no legal self to bind. They could not marry in any legally recognized sense. Crucially, they had no standing in a court of law. A slave could not bring a lawsuit against anyone, not even for the most grievous physical assault. Conversely, if their testimony was required in a legal case, it was considered valid under torture, a procedure predicated on the belief that a slave, as a piece of property, had no inherent honor and would only tell the truth when subjected to extreme physical coercion. The body of the slave was in the eyes of the law an object from which information could be forcibly extracted, just like any other inanimate piece of evidence. This legal status as property translated into a complete negation of bodily autonomy. The owner of a slave had the absolute legal right to use, lease, sell, or dispose of that slave's body as they saw fit. This included the right to command their labor, to discipline them, to physical punishment, and to use them for sexual purposes. The modern concept of rape, predicated on the idea of individual consent, had no legal meaning when applied to a slave. A slave's body was not their own to give or withhold consent for. It belonged to their master. Therefore, the sexual use of a slave by their owner, or by a third party with the owner's permission, was not a crime against the slave. It was simply an exercise of the owner's property rights. This is the legal context into which the Hierodoulos was placed. However, their situation was made infinitely more complex and inescapable by the heroes, the sacred aspect of their status. Their owner was not a mortal citizen, but the goddess Aphrodite herself. The temple administration acted as the legal guardian and steward of the goddess's property. This divine ownership, which provided a veneer of sanctity and a degree of physical protection from random violence, was also the ultimate legal trap. A slave owned by a private citizen might, under certain circumstances, be granted their freedom through manumission. Their master might die and a more benevolent heir might take over. They might even manage to escape, though the consequences of capture were severe. For the Hierodoulos, none of these avenues were available. How could a mortal administration mighty a slave who was the legal property of an immortal goddess? Such an act would constitute theft from the divinest acreage of the highest order. The bond of servitude was not a contract with a person, but a sacred covenant with a deity, and it was therefore perpetual and unbreakable. Their consecration legally sealed them into their role for life. Consequently, there was no external authority to which they could appeal. If a patron was unusually cruel or violent, the Hierodoulos had no recourse. Complaining to the temple administrators would be futile. The administrators' primary concern was the satisfaction of the patrons who funded their entire operation. Appealing to the city's magistrates was impossible, as they were not legal persons and the temple's sacred precinct lightly enjoyed a degree of legal autonomy. They were wrapped in a state of perfect and perpetual powerlessness, their bodies legally defined as sacred property, their lack of autonomy sanctified by the very goddess to whom they were enslaved. Given the legal and institutional architecture of absolute control, the question of resistance becomes both inevitable and profoundly bleak. The human spirit, even when systematically brutalized, rarely submits entirely. Yet, within the context of the Acrocorinthian temple, any act of defiance was a desperate gamble against a system designed to preempt and crush such impulses with overwhelming force. There are no historical records of organized revolts or mass uprisings among the Hierodoulos of Corinth. This silence in the historical record is not evidence of widespread contentment, but rather a testament to the terrifying efficiency of the temple's control mechanisms. Organized resistance would have been virtually impossible. The slaves were isolated from the general population, constantly supervised, and their communal life was likely structured to prevent the formation of strong, independent factions. They were a diverse group brought from different lands, speaking different languages, deliberately traumatized to prevent solidarity. Overt acts of individual defiance, while undoubtedly occurring, were acts of near-suicidal desperation. The most direct form of resistance was the simple refusal to perform one's duty to deny a patron. This was not treated as a minor infraction. It was a direct assault on the temple's core economic function and its religious authority. The calculus of punishment in such a case would have been swift and brutal, to force the individual's compliance and to make a terrifying example for all other slaves. The non-compliant Hierodoulos would be removed from service and subjected to severe physical discipline. This could include public flogging within the slave quarters, deprivation of food and water, or solitary confinement in a dark cell. The pain was a tool to break the will, but the public nature of the punishment was a message to the entire community. The cost of a single moment of defiance is an agony that will make submission seem like a mercy. If these measures failed, the temple had the ultimate recourse: to sell the defiant slave. This was not a release into freedom, but a descent into an even deeper hell, the silver mines of glory, on or the life of a galley slave, fate synonymous with a swift and miserable death. Escape was another form of ultimate defiance, but the barriers were immense. The temple was situated atop a formidable Acropolis, a natural fortress. The complex itself was walled and guarded, not only to protect its treasures but also to control its human property. A slave who managed to slip past the internal overseers and the temple guards would then have to navigate the city of Corinth, where they were a stranger without money, allies, or resources. Capture was highly probable. The temple would have employed slave catchers, and any citizen who returned an escaped slave could expect a substantial reward. The punishment for a recaptured Hierodoulos would have been designed to permanently mark them and deter any future attempts. Branding on the forehead with a mark signifying their status as a fugitive was a common practice. This permanently destroyed their anonymity and made any future attempt at a normal life impossible. They would be returned to service, their defiant body now a walking advertisement for the futility of resistance. Therefore, for the vast majority, resistance had to take more subtle, insidious forms, the quiet and declared war of the powerless. These were the whispers of resistance, acts of defiance, so small they might fly beneath the threshold of severe punishment. This could manifest as a deliberate slowness in following commands, a feigned illness or fatigue, or the accidental spilling of expensive perfumed oil. It could be found in the performance of their duties with a cold, mechanical detachment that fulfilled the letter of the command, but withheld any semblance of human engagement. This psychological withdrawal, a form of passive resistance, was perhaps the only safe way to preserve a shroud of inner autonomy. The body could be commanded, but the mind could retreat to a place the masters could not reach. Within their communal quarters, away from the eyes of priests and patrons, a fragile subculture may have formed. Here they might share stories from their former lives, mock their masters in hushed tones, or develop a private lexicon of words and gestures. These small acts of shared identity would serve as a vital psychological defense, affirming their humanity in a system designed to strip it from them. In the final analysis, the most absolute act of defiance available to the Hierodoulos was the one that destroyed the temple's property entirely: suicide. By taking their own life, the slave made the final, irrevocable statement of ownership over their own body. It was a tragic and desperate act, but it was also the ultimate negation of the temple's power and a final ruinous act of economic sabotage. The absence of grand rebellions therefore speaks not of submission, but of a battle fought on a different, more intimate and tragic front. The existence of the temple and its practices was not a secret. On the contrary, it was a famous defining feature of the city, a source of both notoriety and a strange form of civic pride. This public awareness necessitated a complex and deeply contradictory set of social attitudes among the general Corinthian populace. The average citizen had to reconcile the temple's sacred status and its economic importance with the morally ambiguous and often personally debasing nature of its central rite. This reconciliation was achieved through a kind of societal doublethink, a partitioning of the mind that allowed for the simultaneous holding of two conflicting ideas: public piety and private contempt. Publicly, the Temple of Aphrodite on the Acrocorinth was an object of immense civic veneration. It was the city's most prominent landmark, a testament to its wealth, antiquity, and divine favor. The average Corinthian citizen, when speaking in a formal or public setting, would have referred to the temple and its servants with the requisite language of religious respect. They would acknowledge the Hierodoulos as consecrated property of the goddess, participants in a sacred mystery that brought prosperity to the polis. To do otherwise would be to invite accusations of impiety, a serious charge in the ancient world. They would see the processions of the Hierodoulos during major religious festivals and understand them as a vital part of the city's sacred landscape. The temple's economic function was also a matter of public pride. It was an engine of the local economy, attracting a constant stream of wealthy pilgrims and merchants who spent their money in the city's markets, inns and workshops. To criticize the temple's core function would be to criticize the very source of the city's legendary prosperity. This public posture of piety, however, coexisted with a deep-seated private contempt for the individuals who performed the sacred rites. This contempt was particularly directed at the male Hierodoulos. As has been established, the male citizen's identity was built on principles of autonomy, dominance, than the integrity of his body. The male sacred slave was the living embodiment of the violation of these principles. In the informal private conversations of the agora, the gymnasium, or the symposium, the language used to describe these individuals would have been far from reverent. They would have been the subject of crude jokes, gossip, and derision. A citizen male might use the services of a male Hierodoulos within the sanctified space of the temple, but he would never treat that same individual as a social equal outside of it. The Hierodoulos was a necessary but shameful instrument, a tool for a specific sanctioned purpose, but not a person to be acknowledged or respected in the public sphere of male citizen life. This paradox was even more pronounced for the female Hierodoulos. While their role was more aligned with traditional gender expectations of passivity, their public sexual availability placed them in direct opposition to the ideal of the respectable citizen wife or daughter, whose virtue was defined by her seclusion and monogamy. The citizen women of Corinth would have viewed the temple slaves with a mixture of fear, pity, and disdain. They were a constant visible reminder of the potential for female degradation and the precariances of social status. Yet these same citizen women would participate in the public festivals of Aphrodite, acknowledging the goddess, whose power was manifested through the bodies of the very slaves they privately scorned. The Hierodoulos themselves lived in the cross-currents of these contradictory attitudes. On the Acrocorinth, they were sacred objects, protected and managed. If they descended into the city, a rare and likely supervised event, they would have been met with a confusing mix of deference and disgust. People might avert their eyes not out of respect, but out of a discomfort with confronting the living embodiment of their society's most profound hypocrisy. They were a necessary component of the city's religious and economic life, but they were also a source of deep social unease. This liminal status, suspended between the sacred and the profane, the publicly revered and the privately reviled, was perhaps the most isolating aspect of their existence. They belonged nowhere, accepted fully by neither the world of the gods nor the world of men. The complex social contract that allowed Corinthian society to simultaneously venerate and disdain the temple's activities was not self-sustaining. It required constant and meticulous management by a dedicated class of individuals who were the true keepers of the consecrated. This was the temple's internal hierarchy, a sophisticated administrative structure that mirrored a large corporation or a government bureaucracy. It was this organization that translated abstract religious doctrine and economic necessity into the day-to-day reality of systematic sexual exploitation. At the apex of this hierarchy stood the high priestess of Aphrodite. This was not a role for a simple ascetic. It was a position of immense political, ethical, and social power, typically held by a member of one of Corinth's oldest and wealthiest aristocratic families. The high priest was the public face of the institution, the chief executive officer. Their primary responsibilities were strategic: presiding over the city's major religious festivals, managing the temple's relationship with the civic government, the bull and ecclesia, and safeguarding its vast financial and real estate assets. They were more likely to be found negotiating a major loan to the state than personally overseeing the temple slaves. Their perspective was microscopic, concerned with the temple's prestige, influence, and long-term solvency. They were the guardians of the sacred brand, and the Hierodoulos were, from their lofty position, simply one category of asset among many. Beneath this executive level was a tier of professional administrators and junior priests, who formed the temple's middle management. These were the individuals who ran the day-to-day machinery of the enterprise. This group was specialized. A chief treasurer or Tomios would be responsible for the temple's vaults, overseeing the counting of daily revenues, managing the ledgers and tracking the institution's investments. Other officials, perhaps titled DP, Imilete, or overseers, managed the temple's extensive agricultural estates, ensuring that tenant farmers paid their rents on time and that the produce was efficiently brought to market. Scribes were employed to maintain the meticulous records of donations, expenditures, and property acquisitions. These individuals were not primarily theologians. They were accountants, lawyers, and estate managers. Their mindset was bureaucratic. The Hierodoulos entered their purview as figures on a balance sheet. They were concerned with the cost of their acquisition, their daily upkeep, and the revenue they generated. The morality of the system was not their concern. Its efficiency was. The direct hands-on control of the sacred slaves was delegated to a third tier, the front-line supervisors. These were the individuals who enforced the will of the administration upon the bodies of the enslaved. This role could be filled by a lower-ranking priest, a trusted and senior temple slave, or perhaps even a freeman hired for their managerial skills. They were the wardens of the sacred prison. Their duties were entirely practical and often brutal. They were responsible for rousing the Hierodoulos in the morning, enforcing the schedule of bathing and grooming, and allocating meals. They supervised the slaves during their periods of availability, ensuring they maintained the required demeanor. They were the ones who selected which Hierodoulos would be sent to a patron who received them upon their return. Crucially, they were the instruments of discipline. When a slave was defiant, it was the overseer who administered the flogging or ordered the period of solitary confinement. Their relationship with the Hierodoulos was the most immediate and the most coercive. They were the human face of the temple's absolute power. This entire hierarchy was supported by a host of ancillary staff. Guards patrolled the perimeter and guarded the treasury. Cooks prepared the communal meals. Artisans maintained the physical structure of the temple. A physician may even have been retained not out of humanitarian concern, but as a matter of sound asset management to ensure the health and longevity of the temple's most valuable human property. This layered and compartmentalized structure was key to the system's psychological sustainability for its managers. The high priest could focus on noble matters of theology and statecraft. The treasurer could focus on the abstract purity of numbers. The overseer could focus on the simple binary logic of obedience and punishment. Each tier of the hierarchy could thus operate with a degree of moral detachment, their specific duties insulating them from the full systemic reality of the institution they collectively serve. The sophisticated bureaucratic structure that managed the temple on the Acrocorinth was a distinctly Hellenic model of organization and control. The institution it managed, however, was not a Greek invention. The practice of sacred prostitution, in which sexual acts were performed within a religious context for the benefit of a temple, was not an anomaly born of Corinth's unique decadence. Instead, it was the westernmost echo of a tradition with deep and ancient roots in the civilizations of the Near East. The Corinthian temple was not an isolated phenomenon but a Hellenized branch of a much older and more widespread tree. To understand its existence, one must look east, following the trade routes that carried not only amphorae of wine and bales of silk, but also gods, rituals, and ideologies. The most direct and undeniable antecedent to the Corinthian Aphrodite was the Phoenician goddess Astarte. Astarte was a powerful and multifaceted deity worshipped throughout the Levant, in great maritime cities like Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos. Like Aphrodite, she governed love, fertility, and sexuality. But as a patroness of a seafaring people, she was also a goddess of the sea and of war, a protector of sailors and a guarantor of maritime dominance. The Greeks themselves were fully aware of this connection. The historian Hierodoulos explicitly states that the oldest temple to Aphrodite in Greece on the island of Cythera was founded by Phoenician colonists and was dedicated to Astarte. The island of Cyprus, another legendary birthplace of Aphrodite, was a major center of Astarte worship. As the preeminent maritime traders of their era, the Phoenicians established colonies and trading posts throughout the Mediterranean, and with them they brought their gods. Corinth, as a primary commercial partner of these Levantine cities, was a natural point of contact. Phoenician sailors and merchants would have frequented its ports, bringing with them their own religious customs, including, according to numerous ancient sources, the practice of sacred prostitution as a form of devotion to Astarte. This pre-existing model found fertile ground in Corinth, a city whose own identity was inextricably linked to the sea and whose population was accustomed to foreign customs. This tradition in turn reached back even further into the heart of Mesopotamia. Astarte herself was a Western Semitic version of the great Akkadian goddess Ishtar, who was herself a syncretic evolution of the even older Sumerian goddess Inanna. Worshipped in the ancient cities of Uruk and Babylon, Ishtar. Inanna was the ultimate divine embodiment of paradox, a goddess of love and war, creation and destruction, order and chaos. She was a deity of immense power and complexity, and her cults were central to the economic and social life of the Mesopotamian city-states. It is here in the world's oldest urban civilizations that we find the earliest evidence for the fusion of temple economics and ritualized sects. The Greek historian Hierodoulos in his histories recorded a dramatic and now controversial account of a practice at the Temple of Ishtar in Babylon. He claimed that every woman in the land was required once in her lifetime to go to the temple precinct and sit until a strange man cast a silver coin into her lap and invoked the goddess, after which she was compelled to have intercourse with him outside the temple grounds. While modern scholarship debates the accuracy and interpretation of Hierodoulos' report, its existence demonstrates that the Greeks themselves associated the great temples of the East with this practice. This was not a singular tradition but a regional pattern. In Anatolia, the cult of the great mother goddess Cybele, and in other areas deities like Ma involved ecstatic worship and in some cases sacred prostitution. The concept was a recurring feature of the religious landscape of the ancient Near East. The common thread was the idea of the temple as a center of fertility and life force. The sexual act performed within its sacred context was seen as a powerful ritual or form of sympathetic magic that could ensure the fertility of the land, the fecundity of the people, and the general prosperity of the community. The revenue it generated was a practical earthly manifestation of this divine blessing. Corinth therefore did not invent this system. It imported it. The city's character made it the perfect environment for this imported institution to flourish on an unprecedented scale. Its pragmatic commercial ethos stripped away some of the more complex mystical layers of the Eastern cults, refining the practice into a highly efficient, economically focused enterprise. It adopted an ancient model of transcational piety and perfected it, integrating it seamlessly into its own unique social and geographic reality. The Hierodoulos of the Acrocorinth were thus unknowing heirs to a lineage of sacred servitude that stretched back for millennia to the very dawn of cities and temples. Given the public nature and long-standing tradition of the temple's practices, it is logical to search the rich corpus of Greek literature and philosophy for voices of dissent, for a moral or ethical critique that mirrors modern sensibilities. The search, however, is largely a study in silence. The great thinkers of the classical and Hellenistic periods, who debated the nature of justice, the ideal state, and the meaning of a virtuous life, with unparalleled intellectual rigor, left behind no sustained systematic condemnation of the institution of sacred prostitution. This absence is profoundly revealing not of a tacit approval in the modern sense, but of a fundamentally different moral framework that made the practice seem, if not laudable, then at least unremarkable and unworthy of extensive philosophical scrutiny. When ancient writers mention the Corinthian temple, it is almost always in a descriptive rather than a prescriptive tone. The geographer Strabo has noted reports on the vast number of temple slaves, as a matter of fact a piece of data to illustrate Corinth's wealth and fame. The playwrights and poets might use the term Corinthian girl as a shorthand for a promiscuous woman, but this is a social stereotype, not a moral critique of the underlying religious institution. The practice is treated as a feature of the Corinthian landscape, a known characteristic of that particular city, much like Sparta's militarism or Athens' democracy. The moral outrage that a modern observer feels was simply not a common reaction in the ancient world. The reasons for this silence are rooted in the foundational assumptions of Greek society. Firstly, the concept of universal human rights, which underpins modern condemnation of sexual exploitation, was entirely absent. The sharp legal and social distinction between citizen, foreigner, and slave was an unquestioned axiom of their world. The exploitation of a slave's body was not a violation of a person's rights, because in the prevailing view a slave was not a full person with rights to violate. Their bodies were property, was the prerogative of the owner. Since the Hierodoulos were legally the property of the goddess, their use in her service was seen as a legit and usual form of labor. The philosophical debates about slavery, such as those found in the works of Plato and Aristotle, focused on whether slavery was a natural or merely conventional state, not on the specific treatment of slaves or the morality of their sexual use. Secondly, the Greek relationship with religion was fundamentally transactional and pragmatic. Piety (BIA) was less about internal faith or adherence to a strict moral code and more about the correct performance of public rituals and traditions. The primary goal of religion was to maintain a favorable relationship between the human community and the often capricious gods. If the cult of Aphrodite at Corinth was ancient, wealthy, and seen to bring prosperity to the city, then it was considered sinful. The internal mechanics of that cult were of secondary importance to its perceived efficacy. To critique the temple's practices would have been seen as an act of impiety, a dangerous meddling with a divine institution that had proven its worth. The closest one comes to a critique is not a direct attack on the institution itself, but a more general philosophical concern with the dangers of excessive luxury and physical indulgence. Plato in his Republic uses Corinth as an example of a city given over to the appetites, a place where lust and the pursuit of wealth overshadow reason and virtue. He and other philosophers like the Stoics would have viewed the entire Corinthian lifestyle, including the temple's opulence, as a threat to the soul of the individual citizen. A virtuous man, in their view, should practice self-control and not be a slave to his passions. He might therefore choose to avoid the temple, not out of concern for the Hierodoulos, but as a matter of personal spiritual discipline. This is a critique of the patron, not the system. The focus is on the moral health of the citizen's soul, not the well-being or autonomy of the slave. This philosophical silence is perhaps the most chilling piece of evidence. It demonstrates how a system of profound human exploitation can become so deeply embedded in the economic, religious, and social fabric of a society that it becomes invisible to critique. It was not hidden. It was simply accepted as part of the natural order of things. The voices of the hero, Duli themselves, are of course entirely lost to history. They left no diaries, no poems, no legal appeals. Their story is told only through the incidental descriptions of others who saw them not as subjects of a moral tragedy, but as objects of civic pride, economic data, or philosophical caution. The philosophical and social accommodations that made the Temple of Aphrodite stable, a paradoxical feature of the Greek world, were themselves products of a specific cultural context. This entire system, with its intricate balance of piety, commerce, and social hypocrisy, was predicated on the autonomy of the Greek polis. For centuries this system persisted, evolving but unbroken. But the intricate intellectual debates of Athens and the commercial pragmatism of Corinth were rendered obsolete by the arrival of a new, terrifyingly efficient power from the West. The intellectual silence of the Greek philosophers was about to be replaced by the deafening physical silence of a city razed to the ground. In 146 BCE, the history of the Temple and of Corinth itself was violently interrupted by the legions of the Roman Republic. The political context for the disaster was the final futile attempt by a confederation of Greek city-states, the Achaean League, to resist the inexorable expansion of Roman influence over the peninsula. Corinth, as a leading and wealthy member of the League, became a focal point of this doomed resistance. The Roman response was characteristically swift and utterly ruthless. The Senate dispatched the consul Lucius Mummius with overwhelming military forces, mandate not simply to quell a rebellion, but to make a permanent and horrifying example of the city that had dared to defy Rome. After a brief and one-sided military engagement, the Roman legions entered Corinth. What followed was not a mere occupation, but a systematic and calculated act of annihilation. According to contemporary and later historical accounts, the sack of Corinth was an event of unparalleled brutality. The city's male population was almost entirely put to the sword. The women and children, along with any surviving men, were rounded up, their legal status as citizens or residents erased in an instant. They were now simply prey, the spoils of war destined for the slave markets that followed in the wake of every Roman military victory. The city itself, one of the most beautiful and opulent in the ancient world, was methodically plundered. Its legendary art collection, statues, paintings, and precious objects were raided up and shipped back to Rome to adorn the villas of the elite and the triumphs of generals. What could not be carried away was destroyed. Finally, Mummius ordered the city to be set ablaze. The fires raged for days, leaving the once thriving commercial hub a blackened, smoldering ruin. For the Temple of Aphrodite on the Acrocorinth, this cataclysm meant a swift and total end. As the city's most prominent religious institution and its de facto treasury, it would have been one of the primary targets for the Roman soldiers. The legionaries, products of a different religious and cultural system, would have felt little of the pious, or that the temple commanded among the Greeks. To them, it was simply a repository of immense concentrated wealth. The sacred votive offerings of gold and silver, the gilded statues, the treasury's reserves, all were stripped away, becoming rubble to be distributed as donatives to the troops and shipped back to the Roman state treasury. The physical structure of the temple itself was likely gutted by the same fires that consumed the lower city. The fate of the Hierodoulos in this chaos represents the ultimate and most brutal irony of their existence. Their entire identity was predicated on a sacred status that was a purely Greek social and religious construct. To the Roman soldiers storming the Acrocorinth, the distinction between a Hierodoulos and any other inhabitant of the city was meaningless. They were not seen as consecrated servants of a goddess. They were simply men, women and children, part of the conquered population to be processed as property. The protective bubble of their sacred precinct burst, exposing them to the raw violence of the sack. In a matter of hours, their unique ritualized form of bondage was annihilated, only to be replaced by the far more brutal and undifferentiated reality of Roman chattel slavery. They were herded together with the city's former aristocrats, merchants and artisans. Their carefully maintained appearances and youth may have made them particularly valuable commodities in the ensuing slave auctions. A male Hierodoulos, once a sacred vessel in a holy rite, might find himself sold to a Roman landowner to work on an Italian latifundio or worse, to a trainer of gladiators. A female Hierodoulos could be sold to a Roman matron as a domestic servant or to a brothel owner in a provincial town. Their former identity was erased. They were no longer the property of a goddess living within a rigid but predictable system. They became the anonymous property of mortal masters, their fates subject to the whims of a vast and indifferent empire. The intricate psychological and religious justifications that had structured their lives vanished, leaving only the stark and adorned fact of their enslavement. The fire of 146 BCE did not free them. It merely transferred their ownership and extinguished the last vestiges of their former sacred world. For a full century, the site of Corinth remained a desolate ruin, a ghost city deliberately left as a monument to the price of defying Roman power. The Acrocorinth, once crowned with its gleaming temple, stood as a silent, fire-scarred sentinel over the deserted isthmus. But the strategic and commercial value of the location was too great to be ignored forever. In 44 BCE, Julius Caesar, as part of a wider policy of provincial reorganization and colonization, decreed the refounding of the city. Corinth was to be reborn, not as a Greek polis but as a Roman colony, Colonia Larsi Ulia Corinthiensis. The new settlers were primarily Roman freedmen, veterans of the legions, and opportunistic Italians, a population with Roman laws, Roman customs and Roman gold. As the new city rose from the ashes of the older period of religious and cultural negotiation began on the slopes of the Acrocorinth, the Romans, while culturally dominant, had a generally syncretic and pragmatic approach to the deities of the peoples they conquered. They did not seek to eradicate the old gods, but rather to absorb them into their own pantheon through a process of identification or interpretatio romana. The powerful Greek goddess Aphrodite was naturally identified with their own Venus. The temple on the Acrocorinth was eventually rebuilt, likely on a grander, more Roman scale. It was rededicated to Venus, perhaps under an epithet like Venus Genetrix, the mythical art stress of the Julian clan to which Caesar belonged. The crucial question is whether the central practice of sacred prostitution was revived along with the temple's stonework. The direct historical evidence is sparse and ambiguous, but a careful analysis of Roman culture suggests that if the institution did return, it would have been in a profoundly altered and diminished form. Roman attitudes towards sex, religion, and commerce were different from those of the Greeks. While Roman society was far from puritanical, it maintained a stricter conceptual separation between the sacred sacrament, the profane profanuum. The idea of a formal large-scale system of prostitution operating directly within a major temple precinct managed by the priestly class would have sat uneasily with Roman sensibilities regarding religious decorum dignitas. While some cults imported from the East, such as that of Cybele or Isis, involved practices that Romans found exotic or even scandalous, they were often viewed with suspicion by the traditionalist elite. It is more probable that the reborn Temple of Venus functioned primarily as a traditional Roman place of worship, funded by state and private donations. Its economic life centered on landholdings and sacrifices rather than the direct sale of sexual services. The notoriety of the old Greek temple, however, likely lingered. The new Roman Corinth quickly regained its predecessor's reputation as a bustling licentious port city. The lower city would have been filled with taverns and brothels lupanaria catering to the diverse rangeant population. It is plausible that a form of religiously themed prostitution continued in the vicinity of the temple, perhaps in buildings just outside the sacred precinct, with proprietors claiming a loose affiliation with the cult of Venus to lend their enterprise a veneer of exotic allure. The patrons would be much the same as before, sailors and merchants, but the formal theological justification that had defined the Greek hierodoulos would have been absent. The institution, if it existed at all, would have been a shadow of its former self, a commercial enterprise with a religious theme rather than a religious institution with a commercial function. Into this complex evolving environment of Roman civic religion and bustling port city vice, a new and radically different ideological force began to arrive. It came not with legions of merchants' fleets, but in the minds of itinerant preachers and small dedicated communities. This was the nascent Christian movement, around 50 CE, a little less than a century after the city's founding. The Apostle Paul arrived in Roman Corinth. He stayed for 18 months working as a tent maker and preaching in the synagogue and the marketplace. The message he brought was philosophically and morally antithetical to everything the old temple on the Acrocorinth represented. Christianity introduced a series of revolutionary concepts into the Corinthian milieu. It preached a radical dualism that posited an absolute separation between the spirit and the flesh, with the latter often viewed as a source of sin and corruption. It championed chastity and monogamous marriage as the only legitimate expressions of sexuality. Crucially, it proclaimed that the human body was not a tool for pleasure or a commodity for sale, but a temple of the Holy Spirit, and that sexual immorality pornea was a profound offense against God. Paul's letters to the fledgling Corinthian church, preserved in the New Testament as 1st and 2nd Corinthians, are filled with urgent warnings against the very sexual license that defined the city's reputation. He explicitly commands his followers to flee from sexual immorality, a directive that would have had a powerful and specific resonance in a city overshadowed by the legacy, if not the full reality, of Aphrodite's cult. On one side was the lingering pagan tradition of transcational piety and embodied divinity. On the other was a new faith that demanded absolute bodily purity and declared a total war on the fusion of the sacred and the sexual. The shadow of this new god was beginning to fall across the Acrocorinth, and it was a long, dark shadow indeed. The arrival of Christianity in Corinth did not trigger an immediate or dramatic confrontation. For the first 2 centuries of its existence in the city, the new faith was a minority movement, a small, often insular community existing within a predominantly pagan society. The great Temple of Venus on the Acrocorinth would have continued its public rituals, its priests secure in their civic status, largely indifferent to the strange doctrines being preached in the house churches of the lower city. The conflict during this period was not one of open warfare, but of slow ideological attrition, a gradual contest for the hearts and minds of the populace. The Christian community grew not through force, but through a combination of social outreach, a compelling narrative of salvation, and a rigid moral code that offered a stark alternative to the perceived chaos and decadence of pagan life. The turning point came in the early 4th century CE, with the conversion of the Emperor Constantine. This imperial patronage transformed Christianity from a persecuted sect into the favored religion of the Roman Empire. The levers of state power, which had for so long upheld the traditional pagan cults, now began to shift in favor of the church. The flow of public funds that had maintained the great temples began to be diverted to the construction of basilicas. Laws were enacted that granted bishops significant legal and administrative authority. This imperial revolution in the heavens had profound consequences on the ground. The balance of power in cities like Corinth began to tilt slowly but irrevocably. With this newfound power came a more assertive and often aggressive posture towards the old religion. Paganism was no longer simply an error to be corrected through preaching. It was a demonic falsehood to be actively dismantled. The temple on the Acrocorinth, as the most potent symbol of Corinth's pagan past and its reputation for sexual immorality, target for this new Christian militancy. Zealous bishops and monks, backed by the implicit or explicit support of the Christian authorities, began to preach openly against the idols and demons worshipped on the high place. They condemned the history of the temple, likely exaggerating its most lurid aspects, painting it as a fortress of satanic depravity. The long-standing tradition of sacred prostitution, whether it was still actively practiced or merely a potent memory, became the central exhibit in their prosecution of the pagan past. It was proof in their eyes of the moral bankruptcy from which Christianity had come to save the world. The physical decline of the temple likely began in the mid-4th century. The Theodosia and Decrees, a series of laws promulgated in the late 4th century by Emperor Theodosius Hussai, effectively outlawed pagan practices. Sacrifices were banned and state funding for the upkeep of temples was permanently terminated. This economic strangulation was a death sentence for an institution that had once been a financial powerhouse. Deprived of its revenue streams, the temple complex began to fall into disrepair. The priestly class, stripped of their state salaries and social prestige, would have dwindled and dispersed. The local population, increasingly Christian and fearful of the legal and social consequences of adhering to the old ways, would have ceased their patronage. The final act was likely one of direct physical destruction. Throughout the empire in the late 4th and early 5th centuries, mobs of Christian zealots, often led by local monks or bishops, took it upon themselves to cleanse the land by demolishing pagan shrines. The temple on the Acrocorinth, with its infamous history, would have been a prize of unparalleled symbolic value. It is easy to imagine a procession of black-robed monks armed with crosses, hammers and crowbars ascending the ancient path. They would have systematically toppled the statues of Venus and other deities, smashing them into pieces. They would have desecrated the altars, pried the marble facings from the walls, and perhaps set fire to the roof timbers. This was not random vandalism. It was a ritual act of exorcism, a deliberate and violent erasure of a sacred space that had endured for 1,000 years. By the 5th century, the twilight on the Acrocorinth was complete. The great temple was a ruin, its stones being scavenged for the construction of new churches and fortifications. The goddess was gone, her name now a byword for sin. The sacred slaves, the Hierodoulos, had vanished from living memory centuries before, but now the very institution that had created them was being systematically expunged from the cultural landscape. The silence that fell over the mountaintop was not the serene silence of a revered sanctuary, but dead silence of a vanquished world. The ideological clash was over, and the victory of the new god was absolute and unforgiving. The toppling of the columns on the Acrocorinth was merely the physical manifestation of a much deeper and more enduring process. The systematic erasure of the institution from the historical record. The modern historian attempting to reconstruct the lives of the Hierodoulos is confronted not with a wealth of information, but with a profound and frustrating silence. The voices of the slaves themselves are completely absent. The administrative records of the temple that would have detailed their names, origins, and daily routines are gone. What remains is a sparse collection of fragmentary second-hand accounts, often written centuries after the fact and colored by the biases of their authors. This archival void is not an accident of time. It is the result of a series of distinct historical events and cultural shifts that together conspired to silence the past. The first and most catastrophic erasure occurred in 146 BCE with the Roman destruction of Greek Corinth. The temple's archives, which would have been the primary source for any detailed understanding of the institution's inner workings, were almost certainly housed within the sacred precinct. These records, likely kept on perishable materials such as papyrus scrolls or wooden tablets, would have contained the ledgers of income and expenditure, the deeds of sale or dedication for newly acquired slaves, and perhaps even daily logs kept by the administrative priests. This was the raw data of the entire enterprise. The fires set by Mummius's legions, which consumed the city, would have incinerated this invaluable archive. In a matter of days, centuries of meticulous bookkeeping were reduced to ash. What survived the Roman sack was not the detailed administrative reality of the temple, but its reputation, a powerful but imprecise caricature that would be retold and embellished for generations. The second layer of silencing was one of benign neglect by the pagan authors who formed the bulk of our period. Greek and Roman historians, geographers and philosophers were not sociologists or ethnographers in the modern sense. Their focus was overwhelmingly on the affairs of the elite. Politics, warfare, the lives of great men, and the grand sweep of history. The lives of slaves, women, and the poor were treated as incidental a backdrop to the more important drama of the citizen male. When a writer like Strabo mentions 1,000 sacred slaves at Corinth, he does so as a point of interest to illustrate the city's fame and wealth. He is not interested in who they were, how they lived, or what they felt. They are a statistic, not a subject. There was no cultural incentive for an elite-educated man of the ancient world to write a detailed treatise on the lived experience of a temple slave. Such a topic would have been considered trivial, vulgar, and unworthy of serious literary effort. Thus, even before its destruction, the institution was documented only in glimpses, its human components rendered invisible by the inherent biases of the culture that produced it. The third and most deliberate phase of Eros came with the triumph of Christianity. The early church fathers and later Christian chroniclers had a vested ideological interest in the memory of the temple, but not in its accurate preservation. For them, the pagan past was not a subject for objective historical inquiry, but a demonic legacy to be defeated and condemned. They became the primary curators of the temple's memory, and they shaped it to serve their own polemical purposes. In their writings, the Temple of Aphrodite became a potent symbol of pagan depravity, a caricature of unrestrained lust and idolatry. They preserved the most sensational aspects of the tradition, the sexual rites, because it served as a dark backdrop against which the moral purity of the new faith could shine more brightly. In this process, any nuance or complexity was ruthlessly stripped away. The economic functions of the temple, its civic role, the psychological conditioning of the slaves, all others was irrelevant. All that mattered was the sin. The Hierodoulos was no longer a person in a complex and tragic social position, but a simple archetype of pagan corruption. Furthermore, as Christians gained control of the centers of learning and manuscript production, they had no interest in preserving any pagan texts that might have offered a more balanced or detailed view. Any surviving records or accounts from the Roman-era temple would have been seen as profane documents, tools of the devil, and their destruction would have been considered a pious act. The result is that our most detailed textual references to the practice come from the very people who destroyed it. We are left to view the temple through the eyes of its executioners, a perspective that preserves the scandal while annihilating the history. This multi-layered process, a Roman fire followed by pagan indifference and sealed by Christian condemnation, created the archival silence we face today, leaving the sacred slaves of Corinth as little more than ghosts in a hostile historical record. The silence of the archives, though profound, is not absolute. Where the written word fails, the historian must turn to the earth itself, to the mute but eloquent testimony of stone, clay, and metal. The discipline of archaeology, through the patient excavation and interpretation of physical remains, offers a different kind of evidence. It cannot restore the voices of the Hierodoulos, but it can substantiate the context in which they lived, confirming the scale, wealth, and specific religious character of the cult they served. The archaeological record for Corinth is extensive, the result of over a century of systematic excavation, primarily by the American School of Classical Studies at Athens. These excavations have unearthed the cities from its theaters, its shops, and its houses, providing a detailed map of the bustling Roman colony. On the summit of the Acrocorinth, the evidence is more challenging, but equally significant. The centuries of subsequent occupation, Byzantine, Frankish, Venetian, and Ottoman, saw the construction of massive fortifications over the ancient sanctuary, disturbing and often destroying the classical layers. However, careful excavation has identified the foundations of the Greek and Roman temples. While the superstructure is gone, the footprint remains, confirming the existence of a major sacred edifice on the summit. The sheer scale of these foundations attests to a wealthy and powerful institution capable of marshalling the resources for monumental construction, a finding entirely consistent with the literary accounts of a rich and influential cult. More specific and compelling evidence comes from the thousands of smaller artifacts unearthed both on the Acrocorinth and in the lower city. Votive offerings in particular provide a direct link to the personal piety of the temple's patrons. Excavations have yielded a vast number of terracotta figurines depicting female figures, doves, and other symbols directly associated with Aphrodite. These were the mass-produced affordable offerings left by ordinary pilgrims, a material prayer left in the hope of the goddess's favor. More expensive dedications, such as small bronze statues or fragments of inscribed marble plaques, have also been found. One particularly significant type of inscription found at Corinth and other sites associated with Aphrodite is the dedication made by or on behalf of individuals, thanking the goddess for her favor. While none explicitly mention the Hierodoulos, they confirm the transcational nature of the cult where worshippers made offerings in direct expectation of a divine return, the very principle that underpins sacred prostitution. Pottery provides another crucial line of inquiry. The distinctive pottery produced in Corinth was exported throughout the Mediterranean, and its distinctive iconography often reflects local myths and religious practices. Some Corinthian vase paintings depict scenes that, while not explicit representations of the temple rites, show an engagement with themes of sexuality, revelry, and the power of Aphrodite that aligns with the city's reputation. The study of coinage or numismatics also contributes to the picture. Coins minted by the city of Corinth often featured imagery related to its patron deities, including Aphrodite, further cementing the link between the goddess and the city's civic and economic identity. Perhaps the most poignant, if indirect, evidence comes from the physical context of the city itself. The strategic location of the temple dominating the isthmus from its impregnable height speaks to its importance. Its visibility from both harbors meant it was the first and last thing sailors would see, a constant reminder of the goddess's power. Furthermore, excavations in the lower city, particularly around the Lycium Road harbor, have revealed numerous small shrines and deposits of votive offerings, suggesting that the cult of Aphrodite was not confined to the Acrocorinth but permeated the daily life of the port. This archaeological landscape provides a crucial corroboration of the literary sources. It confirms that Corinth was home to a massive, wealthy, and pervasive cult of Aphrodite, an institution with the economic power and social prestige to support the kind of large-scale operation described by writers like Strabo. The stones do not speak the names of the slaves, but they testify to the power of the system that enslaved them. They provide the physical stage upon which the unrecorded human drama took place, allowing us to see the foundations of the sacred prison, even if its inmates remain forever in shadow. The stones and clay provide the stage as meaningless without the actor, while the historical and archaeological records provide the architectural plans of the institution. They remain bereft of the human figure. To bridge this archival chasm, we must engage in an act of careful, disciplined reconstruction. By synthesizing all the available evidence, the pathways into servitude, the economic logic of the temple, the psychological pressures, the legal framework, we can assemble a plausible composite portrait of a single anonymous life. This is not a biography of a known individual, for none are known. It is the hypothetical account of an archetype, a necessary ghost to give a human face to the fragments we possess. Let us call him Macum Des. Though his birth name was likely something else, a name spoken for the last time on the day his Ionian city was sacked by a rival polis. We can surmise he was born around the year 420 BCE, the son of an artisan. His first 15 years were unremarkable, filled with the education and social rhythms of a freeborn boy in a small Greek city in Asia Minor. This world ended in a single day of fire and slaughter. Captured in the fighting, he was herded with other youths onto a ship. In the slave market of Corinth, a bustling, brutal clearinghouse of human misery, he would have been stripped, oiled, and inspected like a prize horse. A temple administrator, a discerning buyer with a keen eye for unblemished, symmetrical features and the posture of good health, would have examined his teeth and limbs, assessing his potential value as a long-term asset. The transaction was completed. He was no longer a person. He was a votive offering purchased with the goddess's own funds. Lead up the steep path to the Acrocorinth, he would have undergone the ritual of consecration. His hair was shorn, his body was ritually cleansed, and he was anointed with perfumed oil. He was given his new name, a name that belonged to the temple, severing the final link to his past. His indoctrination began immediately. It was a relentless process of psychological reconditioning. He was taught the hymns of Aphrodite, the sacred protocols of his new role, and the central and non-negotiable tenet of his existence, that his body was no longer his own but was a holy vessel for the goddess's work. The resistance of the freeborn boy was slowly, systematically ground down and replaced by the placid obedience of the Hierodoulos. For the next 2 decades, his life followed the rigid, monotonous rhythm of the temple. The pre-dawn awakenings, the meticulous grooming, the long hours spent waiting to be summoned. He learned to perform his function with a serene vacancy, a practiced impersonality that was the key to psychological survival. The act itself, repeated hundreds, perhaps thousands of times, became a ritual devoid of meaning beyond its performance. He mastered the art of dissociation, the severance of mind from body, becoming a silent observer of his own physical use. He witnessed the flow of commerce that his body enabled, the coins passing from the hands of merchants and sailors into the ledgers of the temple scribes. He was a gear in a vast machine, a sacred instrument whose only purpose was to convert human design, revenue. By the time he reached his late 30s, his value began to diminish. The first lines on his face, the slight loss of youthful physique, were noted by the overseers with the dispassionate eye of an appraiser. He was summoned for service less frequently. Patrons making larger offerings were directed to the newer, younger acquisitions. The temple, as a pragmatic enterprise, had no room for sentiment. An asset that was no longer generating peak revenue had to be repurposed. He would have been quietly retired from his primary function and reassigned to a more menial role within the temple's vast economy. Perhaps he was sent to work on one of the temple's agricultural estates in the countryside, his days now spent tending olive groves or grapevines. Or perhaps he remained within the precinct as a cleaner or a kitchen hand, a ghost haunting the edges of the sacred world in which he was once a central if powerless figure. His death, perhaps a decade later from a common fever or simple exhaustion, would have been an unrecorded event. His body, its economic utility exhausted, would have been disposed of with minimal ceremony in unmarked graves somewhere on the slopes of the Acrocorinth. He left no legacy, no descendants, no inscription. His entire existence, the trauma of his capture, the years of ritualized exploitation, the long slow decline into anonymous labor, was ultimately condensed into a net profit on a balance sheet in an archive that has long since turned to dust. He is a fiction, but his story in its broad outlines is the truth of thousands who were systematically used, spiritually justified, and then utterly forgotten. To conclude the account with the sack of Corinth in 146 BC, or the final toppling of the temple's columns in the 5th century CE, is to treat the institution as a historical artifact sealed safely in the distant past. This, however, would be a profound analytical error. The story of the Hierodoulos of Corinth is not merely a chronicle of a specific defunct religious practice. It is a case study, a stark and meticulously documented example of a persistent and profane pattern that recurs throughout human history, adapting its justifications to suit the dominant ideology of each new era. The names change, the gods are replaced, the locations shift, but the underlying mechanics of exploitation remain disturbingly constant. The core of the Corinthian system was the fusion of absolute power with a transcendent, unassailable justification. The temple's authority over the bodies of its slaves was not presented as a mere exercise of brute force or economic dominance. It was framed as a sacred duty, a divine mandate. This ideological apparatus was the key to the system's longevity and its social acceptance. It allowed the exploiters, the priests, the administrators, the patrons to perceive their actions not as abuse, but as piety. It also provided a powerful tool for psychological control over the exploited, forcing them into a state of cognitive dissonance where their own debasement was presented as a form of spiritual service. This pattern, the use of a higher and questionable authority to legitimize the physical and sexual use of the powerless, is the true legacy of the Acrocorinth. One can trace this pattern's malignant echo through the subsequent centuries. In the medieval period, the concept of the droit deus ex nero, the right of the Lord, while debated by historians in its literal form, represented a cultural anxiety around the near absolute power of a feudal lord over the bodies of his serfs. The lord's power was justified by a divinely ordained social hierarchy, a great chain of being in which his position was sanctified by God. While not a direct parallel to the commercial enterprise of the temple, it draws from the same wellspring of justified power over the bodies of a subordinate class. The age of European colonialism provided a new vast theater for this pattern to re-emerge, this time under the justification of racial and civilization superiority. The bodies of enslaved African women and men were systematically exploited by slave owners, who justified their actions not with the theology of Aphrodite but with a toxic mixture of pseudo-scientific racism and a perverted interpretation of Christian scripture. The slave was deemed inherently inferior, a piece of property, and the owner's sexual access was simply another right of ownership. The civilizing mission became the new sacred mandate, a higher purpose that laundered the base reality of brutal exploitation. In the 20th and 21st centuries, the pattern continues to adapt. In the context of modern cults, charismatic leaders often claim a unique connection to the divine or a higher state of consciousness. This claimed spiritual authority is then used to justify the sexual exploitation of their followers. The followers are convinced that submitting to the leader's desires is not abuse, but a necessary step on the path to enlightenment or salvation, a modern echo of the Corinthian patrons' communion with the divine through the body of the sacred slave. Even in secular contexts, the pattern persists. In totalitarian regimes and within the structures of human trafficking networks, a powerful ideology, be it political purity, national destiny, or simple criminal greed, is used to dehumanize victims and justify their complete subjugation. The Corinthian temple, therefore, is not a ruin on a distant hill. It is a blueprint. It is the archetypal model for the conversion of power into profit through the mechanism of a legitimizing ideology. It demonstrates with chilling clarity how any system of belief, whether religious, political, or philosophical, can be warped to serve as a sanctifying veneer for the most profane of human actions. The sacred slaves of Aphrodite are gone, but their experience serves as a permanent and vital warning. It forces us to look at the power structures of our own time and to ask a deeply uncomfortable question. What unassailable justifications are we accepting today, and whose bodies are being broken upon their altars? And so we pull back from the cold particulars of the case file. The ledgers are ash, the names are lost, and the voices that might have testified are silenced by millennia of dust. What remains is not judgment, for history is a true courtroom, but a quiet and heavy contemplation. The story of the Corinthian temple is unsettling not because it was a product of savagery or chaos, but because it was a product of savagery or chaos, but because it was a product of civilization. It was an institution of immense organizational complexity, economic sophistication, and deep cultural integration. It demonstrates the terrifying ease with which a society can normalize the unthinkable, weaving it so deeply into the fabric of religion and commerce that it becomes invisible to those who live within it. The line between a sacred right and a system of abuse, between a prosperous society and an engine of exploitation, is drawn not in stone but in the fragile consensus of human belief. The questions they leave us are not about the ancient world but about our own. How do we distinguish genuine authority from the performance of power? And what is our duty to those who are rendered silent and invisible by the sacred justifications of our own age? As we leave the Acrocorinth to its ghosts, let the silence that follows be a space for this reflection. Their voices were silenced long ago. By telling their story, we give them one final echo. Let us honor it. Thus concludes the article.